And then as people join, I will go ahead and let them in. So.
Wonderful. Well, welcome all. Nice to see you. I'll apologize if I sound a little bit stuffy. My daughter Avital brought a cold home, and it's not too bad, but I'll be taking some sips of water. Nice to be with you all and to study a little bit this evening. In the winter semester, or fall semester, I guess we call it, of these classes, we had two that are sort of in the same series as this one. One was looking at some texts from Jewish tradition that dealt with angels, both from the Torah and from rabbinic literature, and also actually beyond that. And we also had a class on Satan, or Satan, and demons in the Jewish tradition. And so continuing sort of in that vein of looking at some texts that speak about mythical creatures, beasts, fantastical beings in Jewish text and in Jewish tradition. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. I have a few of them that I wanted to focus on, not that that is an exhaustive list or grouping, but a few where there are some interesting texts to bite into. And I hope that we'll also speak about, in addition to the texts themselves, of what do we gain from the existence of these texts, and how can we take these sort of mythical, fantastical things from our tradition and make that something relevant for us in our own Jewish lives. So that is sort of the scope of what I hope to do this evening. And would love to know, before we really start jumping in and looking at the texts, do any come to mind when you think about mythical beasts or creatures that you've heard of that have a place in Jewish tradition?
The Golem.
The Golem, yeah. And we'll take a look at a couple texts that deal with that towards the end. The Golem is, for me, the first one that probably comes to mind.
Do Dybbuk's qualify?
Dybbuk's, I was kind of going back and forth, but I guess I'd put that more in the category of a demon, right? As sort of a possessing thing. So I did not include that this evening, but I think for that other class in the fall, probably a Dybbuk would be in that category.
What about Jonah and the giant fish?
Okay, so there is the big fish in the book of Jonah that swallows him up, and he spends some time in the belly of that large fish. So, is this describing a whale? Is this describing something other than what we might know from the natural world? Certainly it's behaving differently, right? Functioning differently than the way we know whales or large fish to function. I can sort of imagine Pinocchio as well in the belly of the whale. But interestingly, in some of my research, there was a being that we'll look at pretty early on that in some midrash actually did have a role in that Jonah story. And in that midrash, they actually speak of that large fish that swallowed Jonah just as, a very normal large fish, or what we might call a whale. And that's not the fantastical part of the midrash. There is another being that is even more fantastical than that. So I'd say, yeah, I'll give that a half point.
Well, if we're putting the whale, what about Goliath?
Goliath, yeah. So that sort of like a giant human being, right? That David, had to fight as sort of the warrior of the Philistines,
Right.
who the Israelites were warring with. we are going to look at that idea of giants. So that is, and maybe he is part of that category. All right, so I am going to share my screen where you will find the texts. And you see at the top, the first being that we are going to look at, which is the Leviathan. So we are going to be studying some texts from the Torah and also from Talmudic and Midrashic literature. So let's recite a blessing for Torah study. It starts just like the Shabbat evening candle blessing, but ends with the words La'asok b'divrei Torah. So please feel free to join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, the eternal, our God, sovereign of all time and space, who makes us holy with commandments and has commanded us regarding enriching ourselves, busying ourselves with words of Torah. The first being that we are going to look at is the Leviathan, which is the sea monster in Jewish literature. And this is sort of the second one that came to mind when I was thinking about this class, in part because I don't think most camps sing this anymore, but there was an old camp song called Levi the Leviathan by Rabbi Larry Milder, I believe. So it was like, Levi the Leviathan, swimming in the Sea of Galilee. So that is in my head when I hear the word Leviathan. And the first text we're going to look at comes from the book of Genesis, from that creation story, right? Chapter 1. And it doesn't say Leviathan in this text, but this is sort of seen as the origin for this idea of a giant sea monster. So we read in Bereshit, in Genesis 1, Vayivra Elohim et ha-taninim, and that's the word that you see translated as sea monsters. Et ha-taninim hagedolim, the great, the big. Et kol nefesh hachaya, and all of the living creatures. Haromeset asher shartzu hamayim le minehem ve'et kol of knaf le minehu vayar Elohim kitov. So God made all of the living creatures, every kind that creep, which the waters brought forth in swarms, and all the winged birds of every kind, and God saw that this was good. So as part of this day of creation, in which the creepy crawly things and the things from the water and birds are created, we also have et ha-taninim hagedolim, the great sea monsters. I've also seen this word tanin translated less fantastically as like an alligator or a crocodile. So sort of a large aquatic animal, or largely aquatic animal.
I think of the Loch Ness monster.
Yeah. So that's kind of what Leviathan is. At times a bit more sinister or a bit more menacing than that, but yeah, more or less it is sort of like Nessie. And the basis for this belief and for these texts is going to be right here in the book of Genesis. And that it's something created by God, obviously. And at the end of this day, right, it says, Vayar Elohim kitov, and God saw that it was good. So it wasn't some big mistake that God created this thing or these things. I guess there's more than one. But that it was good. So now we get Rashi, who is the preeminent commentator, and this is his commentary on that verse from the Torah. And so you see when it bolds this word, that hatinanim, right? That's the word that he is commenting on. That's sort of the place where he says, okay, this we really need to explain what these things are and what you're supposed to understand from this. So they say that these were huge creatures, the large fish that are in the sea. And according to the statement of the Agadah, that is, Agadah is sort of like Midrash, it's a story. And he's going to be quoting from Bava Batra 74b, which is in the Babylonian Talmud. It's one of the tractates. So he's not just pulling these ideas from his imagination, he's basing his commentary on Midrash from the Talmud. And so he says that they say that that this word of sea monsters, sea huge creatures, it means here Leviathan, the Leviathan, and its consort, which God created, male and female. So the Hebrew for these sea creatures, it's not in the singular, it is in the plural, right? So he's saying that it wasn't just one of them, but it was two, and they were male and female when they were created. God, however, killed the female and preserved it in salt for the benefit of the righteous in the time to come. For they had been permitted to be fruitful and to multiply the world. For had they been permitted, the Leviathans, had they been permitted to be fruitful and to multiply, the world could not have endured because of them. And he says, Nefesh Chaya, which was another part of the verse, is everything that has vitality. So that's a little bit to the side. But he's taking this idea of the great sea creatures and saying, okay, well, it's in the plural, it has to be more than one. But he also maybe has this tradition that there is one Leviathan. So he has to make that work and say, okay, well, what happened to the other one? So,
and what's his thinking about that they couldn't have been permitted to be fruitful and to multiply because the world could not have endured because of them? Is it because they just would have been so big that they would have taken over the world? Is that the thinking? Or
I think so. I think that in the Jewish imagination, the Leviathan is so enormous that if there's more than one of them, if there's lots and lots of them, that they would just fill up the sea, or maybe they would gobble up all that is in the sea, and people wouldn't have fish to eat. That it would have thrown things off. So in order to maintain some balance and to let everything else in the world survive, God killed off the female, because of course they chose the female to kill off. And what did God do with it? Made a bunch of locks, right? Preserved it in salt, so that in the world to come, the tzaddikim, the righteous people, can eat the female Leviathan. So if you ever wondered where the Jewish affinity for cured smoked fish comes from, there we go. Rashi is a good source to look at. So this is bizarre, right? that God is preserving this enormous being as a treat that the righteous people get to have some of in the world to come, in the Messianic age. And depending on what this creature is, it's possible that it's not actually a kosher sea animal, right? If a sea animal has to have both fins and scales in order to be kosher, and in some imaginations, this is kind of more dragon-like. And so interesting that in the world to come, those righteous people, maybe they don't actually need to abide by the laws of kashrut, at least when it comes to eating of the giant sea creature. So this is Rashi on the Leviathan. And if you're saying, okay, this is a little bit far-fetched, we can look at other parts of the TaNaKH to see some clues about this being and this belief. So here we have in Psalms 74, them actually using this word of Leviathan, which is right here where my cursor is, Leviathan. Speaking of God, right? Psalms, a lot of the times they speak about the amazing things that God has done. So it says, it was you, God, who crushed the heads of Leviathan, who left him as food for the denizens of the desert. So I'm not sure exactly what the psalmist was thinking about or what the psalmist meant in this piece, but this is a verse that people will point to and say, see, there is a Leviathan and it is there as food. Excuse me. And in some way, the Leviathan now maybe not is not as kitov as we saw in Genesis, is not as good a creation that God is happy with, right? The Leviathan is something that God, it seems, has done battle with. So maybe it was a threat to God or to other beings in the world. Any reactions to any of this so far? Were you aware of the giant sea creature or the Leviathan previously? And how does it feel to know that this is, you know, a decent part of Jewish tradition? That
Why would there be the need to create this?
That's a good question. What do you think?
I mean, especially when God is going to turn around and kill one of the sexes immediately.
Right. Why would God have created both? Right? Maybe God should have just created one, but what if God was going to kill the female one? Why would God have created both of them? Unless God wanted to have something for the righteous people to eat in the world to come.
For that matter, why create something that's creepy? Humans innately don't like creepy things.
Right, and we could say that about other parts of creation, of like, why does this thing exist? What good does this bring into the world?
Clearly, Kinneret is not a fan of the Leviathan.
Yeah. Well, the room where I teach also doubles as the changing station, so that's what's going on in the background. And she's not a fan of that, it seems. But that'll come to an end. So let's keep looking. And it gets even more fantastical than what we've seen. And this is Bava Batra. So this is part of Rashi was mentioning Bava Batra. So there is this discussion of sort of fantastic creatures. And oh, she got put down. She's not going to be happy about that. Do we have a volunteer who'd like to read from Bava Batra? I'm going to go on mute while you read.
I'll read it. You can go on mute, Rabbi J. Rav Yehuda from India relates, once we were traveling in a ship and we saw a certain precious stone that was encircled by a snake. A diver descended to bring it up, and the snake came and sought to swallow the ship. A raven came and cut off its head, and the water turned into blood due to the enormousness of the snake. Another snake came, took the precious stone, and hung it on the dead snake, and it recovered. It returned and again sought to swallow the ship, And yet again, a bird came and cut off its head, took that precious stone and threw it onto the ship. We had with us these salted birds. We placed the stone on them, and they took the stone and flew away with it. Apropos the stories of large sea creatures, the Gemara discusses the large sea creatures mentioned in the Bible. The sages taught there was an incident involving Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, who were traveling on a ship, and Rabbi Eliezer was sleeping and Rabbi Yehoshua was awake. Rabbi Yehoshua trembled and Rabbi Eliezer awoke. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, "What is this, Yehoshua? For what reason did you tremble?" Rabbi Yehoshua said to him, "I saw a great light in the sea." Rabbi Eliezer said to him, "Perhaps you saw the eyes of the Leviathan, as it is written, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning."
Thank you, Mindy. So we have this long discussion in Bava Batra of a giant snake, and there's something going on with the bird and the stone, heads getting chopped off. And then we have this other story about Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua out at sea, and Rabbi Yehoshua seeing this great light in the sea that Rabbi Eliezer attributes to the Leviathan, and uses a quote from Job chapter 41 as sort of the proof text for that, of how he knows that a great light at sea means that it was the eyes of the Leviathan. So now we get, right, even more sort of imaginative, even more creative. Why is this in the Talmud? I mean, the Talmud does include stories of the rabbis and things that they've experienced, but it seems like they give a lot of space to this discussion. Right? I mean, this is a big piece of a page of Talmud that they're talking about these sort of fantastical creatures. So, you know, when I see that, it makes me wonder, like, well, why? What are we supposed to learn from that, or why did they think that that was important to include in this body of literature? I don't have an answer to that. One thing that, as I'm reading through it, that comes to mind is we like to think of the Talmud as such a legalistic, rational document, right? It really thrives on academic discussion and breaking apart little pieces of Jewish law. Maybe they think it's important for people to see that, like, these same people who are doing that stuff with some academic rigor also believe in what we might think is what's the word for it, mythical, magical, and that those two things perhaps are not so far away from each other.
To me, it also, I think, underscores the power of God. I mean, if you look at these mythical creatures and the contents that God created them and God can destroy them, it just emphasizes how much power God holds, and it's humbling.
So maybe it's a bit of a way for God to show off God's ability and say, I can create these enormous things that you can hardly believe, and I can get rid of them as well. And that's how powerful I am. So maybe it's supposed to inspire belief and reverence. there are times when we look at something enormous in the natural world that we can hardly believe exists, and just be in this sense of awe, right? That the fact that it actually does exist, maybe something as beautiful or just on such a grand scale. So if we extend that beyond mountains and oceans to living beings that can inspire awe, that maybe that's what this is doing as well. Right? How amazing is it that something like this exists in our world? We might say that about whales, right? If we're bringing it into known large creatures that can inspire awe, and say, without getting creationist, saying, how wonderful that these things are here and that we get to witness them. And there's a little bit of perhaps fear here too, right? That Rabbi Yoshua is trembling when he sees this light. And that word in Hebrew for awe is yirah, which is also can be translated as fear. So awe has in it something that maybe you want to approach, and also something that you want to shy away from. And that both of those things perhaps can lead to a belief or faith in something higher. Glenn.
To me, the obvious question is, why does, in the story of Noah, God chooses to destroy all creatures, all exemplars of, what should I say, to preserve only 2 of each creature that he has created, one male, one female, destroys the rest. In the case of Leviathan, he has apparently had quite a different idea. He's going to destroy just the female, leave only one. It just cries out for, I mean, the contradiction to me is it just screams at me.
Yeah. So in the story of Noah, the idea was that the animals would be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth once again. Whereas with what we saw with the Leviathan is a desire that they not be fruitful and multiply, because that would actually endanger the rest of the earth.
So why does he create it in the first place? And then not only does he create it, but he saw that it was good.
Yeah. Well, created it in order to feed it to the righteous people in the world to come.
In order to?
Yeah.
I don't know. By the way, I wanted to ask before about the anyway, the dual or plural of the heads of the Leviathan.
Okay.
In previous text. Where crush the heads, yeah. Rashi, Leviathan is the heads of the Leviathan. How many heads does the Leviathan have? And then related to that, in the story of Yoshua and Eliezer, how many eyes? Presumably, let's just posit 2 eyes per head. So we're talking now about a minimum of 4 eyes that Eliezer saw, or Yoshua saw, or whatever. Has anybody commented on that?
I did see some commentary about it being a multi-headed beast, perhaps because of this part from Psalms that is clearly in the plural of Rashi Leviathan, the heads of Leviathan singular. So more than one head, it seems. Maybe
it seems, and related to that, is there a plural of Leviathan, or does Leviathanim, or because heads of multiple Leviathans would suggest that each one had only one head,
Right.
but
Not
you
that
never see it in the plural, do you?
not that I've encountered. Because even here in the Rashi, when he's talking about two, it says Leviathan uvein zugo, his partner or his consort. So even here, it's the Leviathan, who presumably is male, and his consort. So we don't have the plural version there, even when we're talking about two creatures. One more piece, and this is much later. This is from the Zohar. So this is the mystical text, which maybe we would expect to see something like this in mystical literature. And so the Zohar teaches that its tail is placed in its mouth. In other words, the wondrous creature has neither beginning nor end, right? It's just like a circle. Undetected, it surrounds and unites the entire world. This hidden unity will be revealed in the future when the righteous tzaddikim will feast on the Leviathan. So that there
Sounds
is,
like a womb to me,
oh, interesting. Go on.
where it's wrapped around the world, kind of like I picture it being wrapped around the earth,
Uh-huh.
kind of as a womb.
Yeah, insulating, uniting, maybe life-giving. I don't know what it says then that the tzaddikim will eat it in the world to come.
Maybe that goes to the previous story, where they preserved it and salted it and
Yeah.
created law.
Yeah, so here in the Zohar, right, it's less of a threat and much more supporting. That it being a circle is something that we shouldn't be afraid of, but is something that it unites us, even though we don't see it.
I think there are such creatures in other traditions as well, aren't there?
I'm not sure. Tell me.
I thought there was a snake with its tail in its mouth. No,
In that case, is the snake consuming itself? Like, is it destructive to itself, I guess is the question in that case.
no, it's just the inventor of the wheel.
Oh, okay. So, all right, so that's Leviathan. That is the great sea creature that we have in our literature. The next being I want to look at is Behemoth. Behemoth, which we'll take a look at, we get a description in the book of Job, just a little bit earlier than where we had that proof text from Job about the Leviathan. So Job talks about both of these beings. And so we have a good number of verses from Job that I brought because it was striking to me that we get such a description of this behemoth. This is, as we'll see, a creature that is a land-based creature, not a sea-based creature. Take now Behemoth, whom I made as I did you. This is God speaking to Job. He eats grass like the cattle. His strength is in his loins, his might in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stand up like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are like tubes of bronze. His limbs like iron rods. He is the first of God's works. Only his maker can draw the sword against him. Okay, so God's, again, this is about God's power, right? The power of the behemoth, but also God's power as the one who made it and the one who could take it away. The mountains yield him produce, where all the beasts of the field play. He lies down beneath the lotuses in the cover of the swamp reeds. The lotuses embower him with shade. The willows of the brook surround him. He can restrain the river from its rushing. He is confident the stream will gush at his command. Can he be taken by his eyes? Can his nose be pierced by hooks? Meaning it's not just like a regular bison or cattle, that this is something entirely different. So that is the basis for the idea of Behemoth, which is this magical creature that is on land. And we have some Rashi to better understand verse 20 here. For the mountains bear food for him, as it is written in the book of Psalms, Behemoth upon 1,000 mountains. 1,000 mountains bear food for him. He feeds on all of them every day, and they are grown again the next day. So just so we have a sense of scale for this being, right? 1,000 mountains are the ones that bear him food each and every day, and then it's renewed. So I'm thinking about sort of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox, right? This super large, unbelievable, and it seems also beneficial, right? If we look at the description in the book of Job, there's a lot of power in the behemoth, but it's not a threatening power. Right? He lies down beneath the lotuses and the cover of the swamp reeds. Right? There's something embracing here, and he's sort of in touch with the natural world around him. He does have the power to stop the river from flowing and to let it flow again, but I don't read this as a threatening thing or as a dangerous thing. So when we think about these very large creatures, we might think of them as threats to us, but the texts seem to be pointing to something a little bit different. They are not necessarily things to be afraid of.
I almost see this as being an auroch, one of the extinct cows that was 6 feet tall.
Huh. When did they become extinct?
In the Pleistocene era. Oh, it is 1627 is when they became extinct.
Ah, okay.
But they were, 71 inches at the shoulder.
Huh.
So much bigger than our current cows.
Right. I found there were fewer texts that I was able to find on Behemoth, which I find somewhat interesting, that the Leviathan kind of has more imagination to it, that people have engaged a bit more with that. And we're going to see a little bit later on a third creature that is sort of in this trio, which is a bird. So we have sea, land, and bird giant creatures, but we'll put a pin in that and then instead go to the Nefilim. The Nefilim, we talked a little bit earlier about the potential for giants, right, with Goliath. And so Nefilim are sort of seen as the giants in more human form than the other creatures that we've been looking at. And the word Nefilim and the origin story for them comes from Genesis 6. And this precedes the story of Noah and the destruction, or the flood. We have anyone who would like to read in the English Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4?
I can read it again if nobody else will.
Thanks, Mindy.
When men began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them, the divine being saw how beautiful the daughters of men were and took wives from among those that pleased him. The Eternal said, "My breath shall not abide in humanity forever, since it too is flesh. Let the days allowed be 120 years. It was then and later too that the Nephilim appeared on earth, when the divine beings cohabitated with the daughters of men who bore them offspring. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown."
There we go. So we have the Nephilim. So what exactly they are, we're not sure, but their origin story is that some form of divine being impregnated the daughters of men, and then they had these offspring, and the Hebrew is Giburim, right? Heroes, mighty ones, Asher Me'olam Anshe Hashem. That from of old were the men of the name, or you could say the men of a good name. So we have perhaps this tradition of there being these very heroic, perhaps even large humanoids, and saying that the way that they exist is that they are not purely human, but they have some divine nature to them. And perhaps they are giants. So I know when we had our class on demons, that I think somebody had asked about, what about the Nefilim? Like, what's the deal with them? So here's the deal.
Yeah, that was me.
Glenn. So I assume that then you've encountered this text, or at least heard of the Nephilim. So tell me a little bit about
Absolutely.
your interest.
Well, there's a cable channel that's virtually devoted to such things. But putting that aside, I'm just wondering, surely must be this story, this idea of Nephilim, perhaps of Leviathan and Behemoth as well, but surely this one must be shared by neighboring Middle Eastern traditions, such as the Babylonians or Akkadians or Sumerians or whoever that preceded and or lived alongside the Hebrews. I mean, are you aware of such stories in those traditions?
I haven't studied non-Israelite ancient Near Eastern traditions, at least in this category. I know of some parallels in earlier on in the book of Genesis of God sort of overcoming the tohu and vohu and God the unformed and void, which some people look, I think, to the Epic of Gilgamesh and talk about a battle that the godlike figure had with Tiamat, which was, I think, a large sea creature. And so they make a link between Tehom, which is in the Torah as one of the words that the God is sort of on this void, and the word Tiamat, which is very clearly a being that that is destroyed in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But I don't know about the Nefilim.
Although I can't specify it, I can't be concrete, unfortunately, so this isn't going to be worth a whole lot, but I have a very strong feeling that the idea of extraterrestrials, the name of the series on that cable channel is Ancient Aliens, and it's constantly dealing with issues like this in cultures around the world. The idea, I know that there is such in Hindu tradition. I believe there is in many other cultures. The idea that beings that are neither human nor God, but intermediate somehow, come to Earth and procreate with the human species. And then I guess the stories about what becomes of those progeny differ depending on the tradition. But I think, I have the feeling that in the Jewish tradition, the idea is that this sort of attenuates over time, that the progeny born by the daughters of men who are impregnated by these extraterrestrials diminishes in content generation after generation, so that by this point it's barely noticeable, except perhaps in DNA.
Right. So I know that there is something like this in Greek mythology, where the gods go down and cohabitate with human beings.
Oh yeah.
And then you get
Absolutely.
people like Hercules, right? Half god, half man.
Many.
Do great things, right? Or that have great power. And there was actually, on NPR today, I can't remember what the program was, but they were interviewing somebody who has made graphic novels based on Greek mythology that doesn't really pull any punches for the kids who are reading these books, and kind of tells the real story that as it's found in Greek mythology. And this author was talking about Zeus, going down and kind of being the worst husband that Hera could have, of just fathering lots and lots of children that had these sort of superpowers. And so that's what comes to my mind when I look at this part of the story.
Also in the Germanic, tradition. I mean, just look at the ring cycle of Wagner as an example.
Okay. So it's clearly in this kind of a story is in many traditions. And so I just ask people again, why is this something that pops up in the Torah, but also in multiple nations and in multiple types of literature around the world? What is it about this kind of story that we feel the need to tell?
This is Tom, and I think the way I see it is a way to explain why Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph, and Moses, and all the rest of the as they call them, the men of renown, were different than normal humans. So for me, it's an origin story about the leadership that otherwise couldn't be explained, and why we were to accept them.
So my guess is that because this precedes the story of Noah, that all of the Nefilim, these heroic men of renown, would have been wiped out in the flood. So that the only beings that, or the only human beings that exist after the flood, are purely human beings and are not these Nephilim. So that would then include Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, who of course we look up to, but are entirely human. And we might say have very human characteristics, good and bad. And so for me, that's actually part of the power of reading those stories of the Avot and the Imahot, of those people you mentioned, that it wasn't that they had any superpower, but they were entirely human beings, and that in and of itself can be inspiring when we think about them as the origin story for the Jewish people.
I don't think we need to look at just our patriarchs or individual geniuses or leaders in any generation to have the idea that there is something godlike about human beings, something that is at the very least in the image of God, and has cognizance of more than other creatures have, and that is capable of extraordinary things, but is also pulled down by baser instincts.
I have a couple of technical I have a couple of technical questions about this passage. And I'm wondering, Rabbi, if you have any answers. My first question is, the Nephilim are the daughters, or the sons rather, of these divine beings, or the offspring of the divine beings, not the divine beings themselves. And the Nephilim are the heroes of old, the men of renown, but not these divine beings. Is that the interpretation you would place on this?
That's how I'm reading it. Yes, that the Nephilim are the offspring of this union between divine beings and women of the earth.
And offspring or descendants as well.
I'm not, yeah, I mean, maybe, I don't know about how many generations down it's passed, but probably also their descendants.
And also the flood, the place of the flood in Genesis raises the question of what the phrase "and later too" actually points to. How much later? Is there another passage between this one and the Noah story where the Nephilim make an appearance, where the divine beings cohabit with the daughters of men?
Not explicitly that I'm aware of, but you're right that it says in verse 4, Hanifilim hayu ba'aretz bayamim hahem, in those days, v'gam acharehen, and also afterwards.
So it wasn't just those.
And the divine beings, the phrase in Hebrew is B'nai ha-Elohim, the sons of the gods, if we're translating it literally.
Sons of the gods, wow. My third question is, verse 3 seems out of place. What is it doing there? I mean, it doesn't follow from the previous sentence. It doesn't lead to the next sentence. I mean, what's the point of verse 3?
Well, if we read,
it's an important point, but I mean, I don't know why it's there particularly.
Right. Well, if we read before, I mean, we can make some assumptions, right? When men began to increase on the earth and daughters were born to them, the divine beings saw how beautiful the daughters of men were and took wives from among them that pleased them. So perhaps that means that that the offspring of this union had extremely long lives, and God is saying, well, actually, that's not the design. That's not how it should be. that, that maybe one of the powers that they're imbued with when there's this union is extra long life. And so God is saying, actually, no, that's not going to be the norm here.
Are we to infer that the flood was one way of getting rid of long-lived competitors to God?
I don't know about competitors to God, but certainly long-lived beings.
Well, B'nai Ha-Elohim, I mean, sons of the gods. I mean, that's a very suggestive phrase.
Yeah. Yeah. What are they? Are they? Are there more than? Is there more than one God here? What's going on?
There is a theology that posits that there are multiple gods, but only one big God or one chief God.
Right.
And we believe in the chief God, even though we recognize that there are other gods. That's supported by the idea of thou shalt have no other gods before me. I mean, you can't have gods before me unless there are other gods.
Right. Every so often, I like to remind people that we shouldn't mistake the Torah for a monotheistic document. That idea of strict monotheism came probably much later than some of these stories.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me too. Thank you.
Sure. So I just wanted to include a couple of understandings of what these Nefilim are and how they got their name. So Rashi plays off of the root for Nefilim, which is Nun Pe Lamed, which means to fall in Hebrew. And so he says that they were called Nefilim because they naflu, they fell and caused the downfall of the world. He pilu, the world. So they are Nefilim because they both fell and they caused the downfall. They caused others to fall. So that's Rashi. And I'll skip over to Ibn Ezra, who takes another way of looking at this word Nephilim, but also relating it to that same root of falling. He says, they were so named because anyone who saw them lost heart at their huge stature. So that would kind of go more towards Goliath, right? That there's this great warrior who nobody can defeat because of his size, and their hearts fall whenever they see them. So in that case, it would sort of be a nod toward them being giants and insurmountable. So those are the Nephilim. I want to get to the Ziz, which is a very fun name. And I was reminded by my wife that there are actually some modern Jewish children's books about the Ziz. So maybe the Ziz is making a bit of a resurgence. And this word Ziz comes from the book of Psalms. So it is, again, the origin, the basis is there in the TaNaKH. And so we see in Psalms, I know every bird of the mountains. The creatures of the field are subject to me. And this translation kind of skips over this odd word of ziz, which is right here, ziz. Ve'adati kol of, I know all flying thing or every bird, harim of the mountains. Ve'ziz Shaddai imadi. And the Ziz of Shaddai, or of mighty, that's a word for a name for God and usually associated with might. The Ziz Shaddai imadi is with me. So this is where the idea for this great bird, that's sort of the third in the trio of the Behemoth and the Leviathan. People point back to these verses to say, if we actually translated it correctly, it is just talking about this giant bird. And that giant bird is in some way with God or is subject to God.
Where does it say it's a giant bird?
Well, later on, we'll see that the Z's is sort of equated with a giant bird. And so when people do that, they point back to this verse to say, see, this verse you could translate as the creatures of the field, but that's actually just a mistranslation, and you're skipping over what it really is. In Psalm 89, here's what we get. You plucked up a vine from Egypt, you expelled nations and planted it, right? It's talking about the Israelite people, that we are the vine. You cleared a place for it. It took deep root and filled the land. The mountains were covered by its shade, mighty cedars by its boughs. Its branches reached the sea, its shoots the river. Why did you breach its walls so that every passerby plucks its fruit? Wild boars gnaw at it, and creatures of the field feed on it. So it's saying, God, you did this, and we stretched out. Why then did you sort of undo that? And the word that we get for that here is translated as creatures of the field is the Ziz Shaddai. So that same phrase, Ziz Shaddai, which comes from the book of Psalms. So Legends of the Jews is sort of, it's a compilation of different midrashim put together for easy consumption. And so this is where we really get spelled out what the Ziz is. And he begins by talking about Leviathan, but very quickly goes to the Ziz, right?
Who wrote this and when?
So Legends of the Jews is a compilation of midrash, so, and it's from the last century, and it's compiled by Ginsburg. I forget his first name.
Oh, but it actually refers to much older material.
Yes, yeah. He is basing this shorter explanation on lengthier and more diverse midrashic texts. And so what he says is, as Leviathan is king of the fish, so the Ziz is appointed to rule over the birds. His name comes from the variety of tastes his flesh has. It tastes like this, zeh, and like that, zeh. In Hebrew, zeh means this or that. So they're saying that the flesh of the Ziz tastes like this and that. The Ziz is as monstrous of size as the Leviathan himself. His ankles rest on the earth and his head reaches to the very sky. It once happened that travelers on a vessel noticed a bird. As he stood in the water, it merely covers his feet, and his head knocked against the sky. The onlookers thought the water could not have any depth at that point, and they prepared to take a bath there. A heavenly voice warned them, a light not here. Once a carpenter's axe slipped from his hand at this spot, and it took 7 years to touch bottom. So this is saying it's not shallow here, it's deep, even though you might not think it because of what it looks like with this bird. The bird the travelers saw was none other than the Ziz. His wings are so huge that unfurled, they darken the sun. They protect the earth against the storms of the south. Without their aid, the earth would not be able to resist the winds blowing past. So the Ziz here is a benefit, right, to us, is a benefit to the other creations. Once an egg of the Ziz fell to the ground and broke. The fluid from it flooded 60 cities, and the shock crushed 300 cedars. Fortunately, such accidents do not occur frequently. As a rule, the bird lets her eggs slide gently into her nest. This one mishap was due to the fact that the egg was rotten, and the bird cast it away carelessly. The Ziz has another name, Rananin, because he is the celestial singer. So it's a word related to Ranana, of joyous song, Rina. On account of his relation to the heavenly regions, he is also called Sekwi, the seer. Sechvi is a word that we find in our morning blessings. Sechvi vina lehavkin beinomu vein laila. God who has given the mind the ability to distinguish, so Sechvi, the mind. And besides, he is called son of the nest because he is fledgling birds break away from the shell without being hatched by the mother bird. They spring directly from the nest, as it were. Like Leviathan, so Ziz is a delicacy to be served to the pious at the end of time, to compensate them for the privations which abstaining from the unclean fowls imposed upon them. So the flesh of the Ziz in the world to come will be a reward to those who have not eaten unclean birds in their lifetime. Whew, there you go. There's the Ziz. Did you ever know it existed? Or at least that it was in Jewish thought and imagination? But there it is. Just to give you a little bit of where this came from, right? Brachot 57b, which is in the Talmud, talks about the Kanaf Renanim, the bird, or the Bar Yochni, that there are these other words for this giant bird, but we get similar stories about the egg and when the egg fell, what happened. So the basis is certainly in TaNaKH and is in the Talmud, and that's a little weird. I found this rendering of a 13th century illuminated manuscript that has all three of these beings together. So not that this has any authority, but I just thought it was fun to share. And so we have the Leviathan here, we have the Behemoth, and then here is the Ziz that we've just been speaking about.
So the Behemoth actually sounds like what Tom was describing earlier.
Right. Right. Very much like a cow or a form of cattle.
So I have a question about the Ziz.
Yeah.
If the flesh of the Ziz will be a reward for the righteous in the world to come, how does the person who wrote this story know what its flesh tastes like?
Right. If the world to come has not happened yet. How do we know that the name Ziz comes from Zeh and Zeh, like the flesh will taste like this and that? I don't know. It hasn't been revealed to me at this point.
He could have said it tastes like chicken.
Right. Like that. Also in Legends of the Jews, the same compilation of Midrashim that we were just reading from, he speaks about the different times of year where the different creatures that we've been looking at are more active or are more powerful. So just very quickly, in Tammuz, at the time of the summer solstice, when the strength of the Behemoth is at its height, he roars so loud that all the animals hear it. And for a whole year, they are affrighted and timid, and their acts become less ferocious than their nature is. So the Behemoth here is taming all of those other wild animals that might otherwise be a threat to us. So they, at hearing the Behemoth's roar, are actually not as dangerous. Again, in Tishrei, at the time of the autumnal equinox, that's when the high holy days are, the great bird Ziz flaps his wings and utters his cry so that the birds of prey, the eagles and the vultures, blench, and they fear to swoop down upon others and annihilate them in their greed. So again, the Ziz, who's ruling over these birds of prey, calms them down and tempers their violent nature. And again, were it not for the goodness of God, the vast number of big fish had quickly put an end to the little ones. But at the time of the winter solstice, in the month of Tevet, the sea grows restless, for then the Leviathan spouts up water, and the big fish become uneasy. They restrain their appetite, and the little ones escape their rapacity. So again, the Leviathan serves a purpose. We asked, why would God create these things? To manage and to look after or to look over the other beings that are like them, right? The fish, the birds, the land animals. Finally, the golem, which we identified at the beginning as perhaps the one that comes to mind the most, and the basis for this comes from Bereshit Rabbah, which is a classical midrash, and this is also a midrash that we have studied and that we use in other realms. And so it's interesting that they come in the same text. Said Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar, in the hour when the Holy One created the first human, God created this human as an androgynous. That is, as it is said, male and female, God created them. So the first human that was created was sort of ambiguous of sex, and that God, or all inclusive of sex, that male and female, God created them. Rabbi Tanhuma, in the name of Rab Benaiah, and Rav Berachia said, in the name of Rab Elazar, said, in the time that the Holy One created Adam HaRishon, that is the first human being, God created that human being as a golem. God created him, and he was set up from one end of the world unto its other end. That's what is written, your eyes saw my golem, which is a quote from the book of Psalms, Galmi Ra'u Einecha, my golem. So what are the aspects of a golem that God created? That was the first Adam, the first human being. That it went from one end of the world to another, and that we could see it. From Sanhedrin, this is from the Talmud. Now we get maybe a different idea of golem, in that it's not God who has created this primordial being, but there is somebody who can create a golem. That there is some kind of creation that a human being can do of something that has some aspect of life in it. Indeed, Rava created a man, a golem, using forces of sanctity. Rava sent his creation before Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera would speak to him, but he would not reply. Rabbi Zera said to him, you were created by one of the members of the group, one of the sages. Return to your dust. So Rabbi Zera tries to have a conversation with the golem, and the golem does not respond. And he tells the golem, hey, you were created by a human being, by one of us, and so you need to return to dust. That you cannot continue being here with any kind of life force within you.
The word golem here has not yet been defined in any of the readings you presented.
Right.
So we're applying to it our stories from recent centuries, right?
Yes. But what we do see in the text, if we translate the Aramaic, which this is, Rava bara Gavra. So Rava is the name of the person doing the action. Bara, we get from the Hebrew of create, so that is in Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning of God's creating, right, from the Genesis 1:1. So that's the same verb of what God does. And Gavra is like Gever, is a man, or it can also be like a hero or something of might. So you're right that we don't have the word golem in the Aramaic, and the way that this translation of the Talmud works is what's bolded is actually a direct translation, and then they insert some things which are not bolded to make it more understandable to the reader. And that is the Steinsaltz version of the Talmud, who was just until recently a scholar of Talmud, and had a goal of making it more accessible to the modern reader. And so he did a translation where he would kind of put in these little insertions. And so, right, we are kind of reading back into this text, the word golem, because what it says is that Rava created a man.
What's the root, or do we know a root for Golem?
I encountered it when I was looking through some texts, and I cannot remember exactly what it is.
This passage makes me wonder if Mary Shelley was familiar with it.
Right. A modern Prometheus. But we saw with some of the other beings that there are some parallels, right? That there are some things that humans in our stories that are similar to one another, that our imaginations kind of go to the same place with some of these creatures. And so maybe it's not a surprise that we see some similarities in a desire to create a humanoid thing, or to create life in some way across cultures, in Greek culture, in Talmudic culture, in, I guess, would we consider Mary Shelley Victorian? Is that the right time frame?
Frankenstein's monster is not in this category.
Okay. But we see that this is a man, right? A being that had some life force to it that was created from the dust, right? And would return to the dust. Hadar la'afarecha, return to your dust. And just from Jewish Virtual Library, a summary of the idea of what a golem is, and that what we think of as golem came about later, right? The popular legend which adorned figures of leaders of the Ashkenazi Hasidic movement. So that would be like in the 17th century, so much later than the Talmud, for sure. And that's really where this idea of golem became fleshed out. And so the golem became the creature who served its creators and fulfilled the tasks, right, of protecting the Jewish community that were under threat in Prague, right? The Maharal of Prague being the famous one to create the golem. So I think golem is sort of the one that we might be most familiar with, much more so than the Z's or the Leviathan. And I think in part because we're intrigued by that idea of our own ability to create and to make something that is living, and also the desire to have something that is there to protect us, right? That is sort of magical and it has this protective power over us. And then, of course, as the story goes, I'll just focus on this third point right here, is that the golem becomes animate when the word emet is written on its forehead, meaning truth. And then the way of taking away that animation, making it inanimate, is by erasing the aleph from its forehead, and what's left there is the word met, or dead. And so that is how the power is sort of taken away, and that being is returned to dust, as we saw the being asked to be returned to dust from the Talmud. So those are the mystical, magical creatures that I found in Jewish tradition and wanted to highlight. any reactions to any of them, or to what we get from having these in our tradition? Is it just sort of a weird thing that's fun to study, or is there something more to it in your mind?
Can I go back to the Nefilim for a second?
Okay.
The phrase I noticed in the Hebrew, a phrase that I noticed in the Hebrew was B'nai Elohim.
Right.
And here it was translated in English, and we went and ran with it as children of the gods. But Elohim is commonly used to refer to Adonai, to God. So how has it been determined that in that phrase, B'nai Elohim isn't just children of God, which we all are?
So, right. I chose to translate it as literally as possible, because I don't assume a monotheistic outlook from this text that I'm reading, and that in some way, right, the B'nai Elohim, however we're translating that, cohabitated with daughters of men, right, which seem to be different than the B'nai Elohim. We say with daughters of human beings, which seem to be contrasted with B'nai Elohim. So I think we do need to go beyond translating it as, that we're all children of God. I think that the text means something different, and some sort of divine being, whether it is of the God or of multiple gods.
But it could be just of God fooling around with, just like Zeus.
Right, but it doesn't say God was the one who did this. It said B'nai Elohim.
Uh-huh.
Whether that's the angels or something else, we're not sure.
What impresses me the most about these passages is how much they show that at least early Judaism resembled other religions in the area.
Uh-huh.
And how much of what we believe Judaism is today probably evolved over the last couple of thousand years instead of being older than that.
Right. And that there was probably more influence from the surrounding cultures and religions than we might otherwise like to acknowledge.
Yep, absolutely.
Actually, I found, I Googled the serpent eating its tail.
Yeah.
And it's known as the Ouroboros, an ancient symbol. This is from Wikipedia, depicting a serpent or dragon eating its own tail. It entered Western tradition via the ancient Egyptian iconography and the Greek magical tradition. It was adopted as a symbol of Gnosticism and Hermeticism, and most notably in alchemy. So it was apparently, there's an image here as well, common all over the Mediterranean. It says a snake biting its own tail is a fertility symbol in some religions.
Okay. Well, the Zohar sort of imagined the Leviathan as supporting, right? That might be fertility. And Mindy spoke about it as sort of a womb-like being, supporting life and encircling us.
Yeah, it says that here too.
Very good.
A yonic or womb-like symbol.
See, we didn't even need Wikipedia to get there. Well, thank you for going on this journey with me. I appreciate having the opportunity to look at some texts that I had not studied in depth before, and it was fun for me to think about what it might mean for me to embrace these texts and these creatures as part of my own tradition. and something I'm still trying to think through. So I hope for you too that it's something that it seems bizarre and seems pretty far away from how I normally think of Judaism, but as we can see, it's right there in some of our core texts. So something to think about as to why they are there and what that can mean for us.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. This was
Thank you,
helpful.
Rabbi. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Yes, thank you.